Welcome to a new indie devlog about my game, Welcome to Riot Town. In this first video I'm going to be making a start at a procedurally generated city. I'm going to be focusing first on a small neighbourhood block before scaling that up into a large city. Eventually I'm going to be using Perlin noise to generate a height map to give the building some pseudo randomness. I'm making a game about a riot. It's a riot simulator which requires a large city. My city is going to be made up of a number of neighbourhood blocks. These blocks are essentially a 10 by 10 grid, each containing either a building or a street. These blocks are then going to be joined together into a grid formation to create an entire city. To give it some added variation, each block could have an alleyway joining from one side to the other. Only when these alleyways have been positioned can I then add the buildings. A further complication is that each building needs to know which way it needs to face, so I need to do some calculations to work out which way the road is relative to the building, then rotate accordingly and position. My first step was actually to open Blender, not Unity. I created a cube and then exported that. After creating a new project in Unity, I put this square into the grid. I wanted to ensure that Blender 1 by 1 by 1 is the same as Unity 1 by 1 by 1. This turned out to be the case. Having laid out a 10 by 10 grid to form a neighbourhood block, I then had to identify which ones were around the outside. These are going to be forming the roads and the pavements. This was a pretty easy calculation. Before thinking about placing buildings, I really wanted to tackle the alleyways. This is going to add extra interest to each of the neighbourhood blocks and give it an extra element of randomness. I started by picking a random tile around the edge. This will form the starting point for the alleyway. It didn't take long to realise there was a problem. I don't want alleyways to start in the corners, this is just going to look weird. Therefore I added a corner property. This is how far in the tile needs to be in order to be considered an alley starting point. Once the starting tile had been identified, I could then start the algorithm of generating the entire alleyway. The algorithm for the alleyway is essentially, it picks a tile, makes sure it's suitable before moving on and picking the next tile. However, there are some rules to discover which is the next tile. The first rule is that it must be vacant. The tile type can't be a road or an alleyway. The second rule is that it must be adjacent to the previous tile. This is pretty obvious. The third rule is that if the previous square is a road, then the next square must be in the same direction. This is to ensure that there is at least a one tile buffer between the road and a change of direction. The fourth rule is that there is only allowed one change of direction. I could increase this later if I wanted to. So if the change of direction count is greater than 0, then the next square must be in the same direction as the previous one. The fifth rule is that if the next square is a road, then we end the process. Finally, if the previous square was a change of direction, then the next square must be in the same direction. This is to avoid multiple changes of direction too soon after each other. With those rules in place, I started work on trying to get the alleyways to build. You can see here that I've highlighted the squares around the corners that alleyways aren't allowed to start from. It took a bit of fiddling around, but eventually we got there. Here you can see an entire city with alleyways marked in yellow. Having populated the neighbourhood block with now roads and alleyway tile types, I now had to start thinking about building placement. I created a few cube prefabs, just cubes really of different sizes. I put some spots on them so I knew which way is the facing direction. These should always be looking at a street. The real difficulty was positioning them correctly. The tile pivot points were bottom left, that is to say 0, 0 would be the bottom left of the tile. When it came to positioning buildings in the bottom left hand corner, this was really easy. That's the pivot point for the whole neighbourhood block, so just putting it at 0, 0 is already in the correct rotation and the correct position. However, when it came to positioning a building on the right hand side, I now have to flip that building 180 degrees in order to make it face the road. Furthermore, because the building pivot point was bottom left, after flipping 180 degrees I also had to reposition it. Eventually I managed to get the vacant tiles populated with buildings of all different shapes and sizes. The code was a bit messy, but right now I don't really care. I'll come back to it and refactor a bit later. Right now I feel like doing something a little creative, so I opened up Blender and started work on some buildings. The building structures themselves are going to be quite clever. Instead of building 50 different types, I intend to make a few different template buildings and swap out parts to make them look different. For example, a 1x1 grid building will have the front of it taken away. I can then swap in and out different types of shops and will make it appear that there are many different types of prefabs, whereas in reality there's only one. Having created a building in Blender and fiddling around with its pivot point, which was easier said than done, eventually I got it in there and it looked really good. Having replaced all the cubes with simple Blender models, I started to think about the corners. I don't just want to reuse 1x1 buildings that are made for the outsides, I'd rather use custom corner shapes. I think they'll look better and it's more realistic. So back in Blender I quickly mocked up a 1x1 and a 2x2 corner shape. I didn't remove the front part, so at the moment these types of buildings aren't configurable. Having replaced all the cubes and happy with how it was looking, I decided to think about the height. Similar to how the shop fronts are interchangeable, I'd like the building heights to behave the same. That is to say, I'd like to remove the roof, lift it up as high as it needs to be, and then slot in sections between it. Again, this will give the illusion of multiple different buildings. I built a 1x1 section and a separate window that I could swap in and out of different prefabs. Bringing this into Unity and hooking up the code, it didn't take long before I got this result. I returned to the project a couple of days later. I wanted to tidy up some code and replace those ugly debug colours with nicer ones. I wanted the building height to be controlled by a Perlin noise height map. In order to do this, I knew I had to tidy up a lot of code. So after a lot of commenting out, rewriting and generating new colours, this is where we're at. Pretty happy with the progress so far and I can't wait to add finer details. Unfortunately, the performance is really bad. Those individual windows I made are just killing the processor. I'm not sure whether to just replace them with flat images, which might look a bit shit, or do something clever with the rendering. I'm not sure what, but I've got a couple of ideas, such as only rendering the ones in the foreground and replacing the background buildings with just plain blocks. So I created a 2D texture and applied some Perlin noise to it. To start off with, I thought each neighbourhood block could be assigned a height value. That is to say, all buildings on that block be there or thereabouts the same height. I decided against this though, since I had the resolution in the height map, I might as well assign each tile to 1 pixel. With a little bit of tweaking, I eventually got it working and this is what it looks like. I hooked the city generation script up to a coroutine and got it firing after every 1 second. This is how it looks sped up into a time lapse. Looks pretty cool. Kills the processor though. Okay, so it's been a couple of days since I recorded the last section and I just wanted to talk about a couple of optimizational things I've done to improve things. As you can see, these buildings, the windows on them are quite detailed. Individually, not so much, but when you're multiplying that by, say, 10,000 windows, it's going to have a real big knock-on performance. I've got the stats window open here, and if I make this bigger, you can see we've got something like 500,000 triangles here, just in view. If I increase that zoom, it's going up to about 1 million. So what I've done is, you can see these small windows and these larger ones here. When you zoom out to a particular level, they get replaced by very simple cubes with bitmaps on them. Now obviously they look a bit crap at the moment, but it's just a proof of concept. So that has a dramatic improvement. So if you look at the triangles in the stats window in the top right, it's at about 1 million now, but if I zoom out, it drops all the way down to about 200, depending on what face you're looking at. So that has a real big increase in performance, because when you're zooming out, you're obviously seeing more of the city. So it's important that your frame rates stay high. another thing I've tried to tackle is more wasted geometry. And these buildings, obviously they're sitting next to each other. You can't see these sides. You can only see the top part of this red section. So the guys beneath it, obviously hidden from view. We shouldn't be rendering them. So what I've done is, if I lift this guy up, you can see these side sections. He's not actually using them, so we're going to hide them from view. So still a little bit buggy in some places, but it's going to have a quite a big impact, I think, especially if these buildings get any more complicated. So yeah, I just thought I'd update you on the progress of that. And that's the end of the first devlog. Thanks for listening if you got this far. Sorry it was so awkward and a bit stiff, but I'm sure these things will improve. Yeah, my name's Dan Sanderson. Thanks for watching.